Hi folks, we're exploring gentle storytelling and ambient sounds this evening. So, without further ado, let's get this story started. In the quietest moments of the evening, when the world begins to slow its hurried pace, and the sky transforms into a canvas of deepening blues and purples, there exists a realm where stories and sounds intertwine like old friends meeting after years apart. Picture, if you will, a place where the gentle rustling of leaves creates a symphony with the distant murmur of a stream, where tales unfold as naturally as breathing, and where every sound carries with it the weight of 1,000 untold narratives. There was once a small village nestled in a valley where the mountains seemed to cradle the earth itself. And in this village lived an old storyteller named Eleanor, who understood something profound about the relationship between stories and the sounds that accompanied them. She would sit on her porch each evening as the sun made its descent, and the children would gather around her weathered rocking chair, their eyes wide with anticipation. But Eleanor never began her stories immediately. No, she would first close her eyes and listen to the world around her, letting the ambient sounds of the evening guide her into the tale she would tell. The creaking of her chair became the groaning of an ancient ship sailing through mystical waters. The chirping of crickets transformed into the whispered secrets of forest sprites. The distant bark of a dog might become the call of a guardian spirit watching over sleeping travelers. Eleanor understood that stories weren't just words strung together. They were living things that breathed with the rhythm of the world around us. On one particular evening, as the first stars began to pierce through the darkening veil above, Eleanor began a story that would weave through the night like smoke from a dying ember. She spoke of a young woman named Luna who had the peculiar gift of hearing stories in every sound she encountered. When Luna walked through the morning market, the clanging of pots and pans told her tales of feasts in faraway kingdoms. The merchants' calls weren't just advertisements for their wares, but epic poems about journeys across desert sands and through mountain passes where the air grew so thin that thoughts themselves seemed to float away. Luna's gift, Eleanor explained in her soft, measured voice that seemed to match the rhythm of the evening breeze, was both a blessing and a burden. She could never experience silence, for even in the quietest moments, she heard the stories that silence itself wanted to tell. The absence of sound spoke to her of vast, empty spaces between stars, of the moment before creation when everything and nothing existed simultaneously, of the pause between heartbeats where entire lifetimes could unfold in imagination. As Eleanor continued her tale, the real sounds of the evening began to blend seamlessly with her narrative. A gentle wind picked up, rustling through the oak tree that stood sentinel beside her porch, and she incorporated it into her story as the whisper of ancient wisdom being passed from one generation to the next. The sound of a screen door closing somewhere in the distance became the closing of a chapter in Luna's journey, a transition from one adventure to another. Luna, in Eleanor's story, decided to travel the world to collect these sound stories, to understand why she had been given this gift. She began in her own small town, similar to the village where Eleanor now told her tale, listening to the morning routines of her neighbors. The sound of Mrs. Patterson beating her rugs told the story of a woman who had once danced in the grand ballrooms of Paris, but had chosen love over luxury, settling in this quiet place with a man whose laugh could light up the darkest room. The baker's kneading of dough spoke of generations of recipes passed down, each fold and press carrying the memory of hands that had performed the same ritual for centuries. But Luna's journey couldn't remain in familiar territory. She felt pulled toward the unknown, toward sounds she had never heard and stories she had never imagined. So she packed a simple bag, kissed her mother goodbye, and set off down the dusty road that led away from everything she had ever known. Her first stop was the forest that bordered her village, a place where the canopy grew so thick that noon felt like twilight, and where sounds took on an otherworldly quality. In the forest, Luna discovered that nature had its own library of stories. The woodpecker's rhythmic tapping against an old pine wasn't just searching for insects. It was spelling out messages in an ancient Morse code that only the trees could fully understand. Each tap was a letter, each pause a space between words, and if you listened long enough and with enough patience, you could begin to decipher tales of seasons long past, of storms that had bent but not broken these wooden giants, of the countless creatures that had made their homes in their branches and roots. The stream that ran through the forest had its own narrative style. Alina continued, her voice now barely louder than the actual stream that ran behind the houses in their village. Water, Luna learned, was the greatest storyteller of all, for it had been everywhere and would eventually go everywhere. Each drop had been part of oceans, clouds, rain, rivers, and ice. The babbling of the brook was really the mixing of a million different stories, each molecule of water sharing its adventures with its neighbors as they tumbled over rocks and through shadows. Luna spent 3 days and 3 nights by that stream, listening to its tales. She heard about underwater cities where fish built elaborate structures from coral and shells, where the currency was bubbles and the laws were written in the movement of currents. She heard about the journey of a particular drop of water that had been part of a tear shed by a queen mourning her lost love, then evaporated into a cloud that had shaded a battlefield, then fallen as rain on a field of wildflowers that bloomed in celebration of a village's first harvest after a long drought. As Luna traveled deeper into the world beyond her village, she began to notice patterns in the stories that sounded told. Morning sounds were almost always about beginnings, about hope and potential. The rooster's crow wasn't just announcing the dawn. It was proclaiming that despite whatever darkness had passed in the night, the world had been given another chance to get things right. The opening of shutters and doors was the world inhaling, preparing for another day of stories to unfold. Afternoon sounds carried the weight of activity, of stories in the middle of being told. The hammer of the blacksmith wasn't just shaping metal. It was forging links in the chain of cause and effect that connected every action to every consequence. The laughter of children playing was the sound of stories being created in real time, adventures being lived rather than just told. Even the lazy buzz of bees in a summer garden was a complex narrative about the interconnection of all living things, about how the smallest actions could have the largest impacts. But it was the evening sounds that Luna found most profound. Elinor said, pausing to let the actual evening sounds around them emphasize her point. Evening sounds were about reflection, about the stories coming to understand themselves. The setting sun painted everything in golden hues that made even the most ordinary things seem magical, and the sounds of this time carried that same transformation. The dinner bell wasn't just calling people to eat. It was gathering the threads of the day's stories, bringing them together around a table where they could be shared and understood. Luna's journey took her to cities where the sounds were so numerous and overlapping that at first she could barely distinguish one story from another. The cacophony of traffic, conversations, construction, and commerce created a symphony of human ambition and struggle. But as she learned to focus, to pick out individual instruments in this urban orchestra, she began to hear the personal stories within the chaos. The subway train pulling into the station told stories of separation and reunion, of daily routines that had become so automatic that the passengers could sleep standing up and still wake at their stop. The ding of elevator doors spoke of vertical journeys that were metaphors for ambition, for the human desire to rise above, to reach towards something higher. Even the hum of air conditioners and heating systems had their narratives, stories about humanity's endless quest to create comfort in defiance of nature's extremes. In the city, Luna met an old man who sat in the park every day feeding pigeons. He didn't speak her language, but she didn't need words to understand his story. The gentle cooing of the pigeons as they gathered around him told her everything she needed to know. They spoke of loneliness transformed into purpose, of how a simple act repeated daily could create a community, could give meaning to both the giver and the receivers. The sound of seeds scattering on the pavement was like applause for a performance that had been running for years, with an audience that always came back for more. Luna discovered that night sounds in the city were completely different from those in nature, yet they carried their own profound stories. The sirens that occasionally pierced the darkness weren't just alarms. They were urgent narratives about human fragility and the networks of care we had built to catch each other when we fell. The distant music from nightclubs and bars was the sound of people trying to write their own stories, to create moments worth remembering in lives that often felt too routine. Even the occasional car alarm, annoying as it might be, told a story about possession and fear, about the things we try to protect and the anxiety that someone might take them away. After months in the city, Luna felt called to the ocean. She had heard that the sea contained all the stories ever told, that every word spoken near water eventually found its way to the vast libraries of the deep. The journey to the coast was itself a gradual narrative, the sounds changing slowly as she moved from urban to suburban to rural to coastal. The accent of the wind shifted, picking up salt and moisture. The birds' calls changed from the common chirps of sparrow and robins to the exotic cries of gulls and terns. When Luna finally stood on the beach, her feet sinking slightly into sand that had been ground from mountains over millennia, she understood why sailors spoke of the sea as a living thing. The waves didn't just crash against the shore. They spoke in a language older than words. Each wave was a sentence in an endless story that had been telling itself since water first gathered on Earth. The rhythm was hypnotic, like a heartbeat or breathing, the most fundamental sounds of life itself. She spent her first night on the beach sleeping under the stars, and the combination of visual and auditory beauty was almost overwhelming. The stars above told their silent stories of light that had traveled for years or centuries or millennia to reach her eyes, while the waves below spoke of motion that never ceased, of a restlessness that somehow created peace. The occasional cry of a night bird added punctuation to this cosmic conversation, reminders that even in this vast narrative, individual stories mattered. During her days by the ocean, Luna learned to distinguish between the different stories the water told. Calm seas whispered secrets, sharing intimate tales meant only for those patient enough to listen closely. The gentle lapping of small waves was like a lullaby, telling stories meant to soothe and comfort. These were the tales mothers had told their children since the beginning of time, stories about how everything would be all right, about how the morning always came after the night, about how love was stronger than fear. Storm seas, on the other hand, shouted epics. When the wind picked up and the waves grew tall and fierce, the ocean told stories of power and conflict, of forces that shaped continents and swallowed civilizations. The crash of storm waves was percussion for tales of heroes and monsters, of ships that sailed off the edge of maps, of treasures buried and recovered, of loves lost and found again. Luna would stand at the edge of these storms, safely back from the dangerous waves but close enough to feel the spray on her face, and listen to adventures that made her heart race. But it was the transition times that Luna found most fascinating, those moments when calm seas became stormy, or when storms exhausted themselves back into calm. These transitions told stories about change itself, about how nothing stayed the same forever, and how that was both terrifying and beautiful. The sounds of these transitions were complex, layered with multiple narratives happening simultaneously, like an orchestra warming up before a performance, each instrument practicing its own part before they all came together in harmony. One evening, as Luna sat on a piece of driftwood watching the sun sink toward the horizon, she met another traveler, an elderly woman named Coral who had spent her entire life by the sea. Coral had a different relationship with sound than Luna did. She had grown slightly deaf with age, and so she experienced the ocean's stories not just through her ears but through her whole body. She felt the vibrations of the waves through the sand, sensed the rhythm of the tides in her bones. Coral taught Luna that stories weren't just heard, they were felt. The vibration of a cat's purr told a story of contentment that could be understood through touch. The tremor of footsteps approaching told stories of intention and emotion, whether someone walked with purpose or wandered without direction. Even the wind had a texture that could be felt on the skin, each breeze carrying stories from the places it had been. Together, Luna and Coral would sit in comfortable silence that wasn't really silent at all, experiencing the stories around them through every sense available. They noticed how the temperature of the air told stories about the time of day and the season, how the warmth of sun-heated sand spoke of energy stored and released, how the cool of shadow provided punctuation and contrast to the bright narratives of direct sunlight. Coral shared with Luna her theory that every person was themselves a collection of sounds and stories. The beating of our hearts was our personal rhythm section, keeping time for all our other narratives. Our breathing was the melody, changing with our emotions and activities. Our voices were the lyrics, but even more than that, every movement we made created sound and therefore story. The rustle of clothing, the tap of footsteps, the unconscious humming or sighing, all of these were chapters in the books of our lives. Luna had never thought about her own sounds before, had been so focused on listening to the world that she hadn't considered what stories she herself was telling. That night, in the quiet of her small beach cottage, she listened to herself for the first time. She heard the story of her breathing, how it caught slightly when she thought of home, how it deepened when she thought of all the places she still wanted to go. She heard the narrative in her footsteps, how they had grown more confident since she had left her village, how they now carried the rhythms of all the places she had walked. As days turned into weeks by the ocean, Luna began to understand that the greatest stories were told not by single sounds, but by the interaction between sounds, the way they harmonized or created dissonance, the way they built on each other or interrupted each other. The gull calling while the wave crashed, while the wind whistled, created a three-part harmony that told a more complex story than any of them could tell alone. She started to notice the spaces between sounds too, the pauses that gave meaning to the noise. Like the space between words that allows them to be understood as separate thoughts, the silences in nature's symphony were essential to the story. A forest that was suddenly quiet told a story of danger approaching. The pause before thunder told a story of distance and anticipation. The moment of stillness before dawn was the world holding its breath before beginning anew. Elinor paused in her telling, and the children around her looked up, wondering if the story was over. But she was just demonstrating Luna's discovery, letting them hear how the pause made them lean in, and made them listen more carefully to what came next. The story continued. She assured them with a gentle smile, just as stories always continue, even when we think they've ended. Luna's journey next took her to the mountains, where sounds behaved differently than anywhere else she had been. In the mountains, she discovered echo. The way sounds came back changed, carrying not just the original story, but also the story of where they had been. An echo was like a game of telephone played by the landscape itself, each surface that reflected the sound, adding its own subtle changes to the narrative. She would stand on cliff edges and call out words, then listen to how the mountain translated them. Sometimes the echo came back clearer than the original, as if the mountain had understood something she hadn't even known she was saying. Other times the echo was distorted, turned into something entirely new, a collaboration between her voice and the ancient stone. In the thin air of high altitudes, Luna found that sounds carried differently. They seemed both clearer and more fragile, like crystals that might shatter if handled too roughly. The stories told at altitude were sparse but profound, each sound carrying more weight because there were fewer of them. A bird call at sea level might be lost in the general chorus, but at the peak of a mountain, that same call became a solo performance that echoed across valleys. She met mountain climbers who told her that at the very highest peaks, where the air was so thin that breathing became conscious work, sounds took on an almost sacred quality. Every word spoken required effort, so no one wasted them. Stories became distilled to their essence, like poetry where every syllable mattered. The crunch of snow under boots became a meditation on progress and perseverance. The whistle of wind through rocks was the mountain itself telling stories of erosion and time, of how even the mightiest peaks would eventually return to the sea. In the mountains, Luna also discovered the story of avalanches, how a sound as small as a shout could trigger a catastrophic narrative of destruction. This taught her about the responsibility that came with making sounds, how our stories could have consequences we never intended. She learned to move more quietly, to listen more than she spoke, to understand that sometimes the best story was the one that went untold. Winter in the mountains brought new sounds and new stories. The crack of ice forming told tales of transformation, of water slowing down until it became solid, of movement becoming stillness. The soft fall of snow was like whispered secrets, each flake carrying its own unique narrative of formation in the clouds and journey to the earth. The muffled quality of sounds in heavy snow created an intimacy, as if the whole world had shrunk to just the immediate space around her. She learned that cold had its own sound, a brittleness that affected everything from the snap of twigs to the quality of voices. Stories told in winter were different from those told in summer, more introspective, more focused on survival and warmth and the promise that spring would come again. The sounds of winter were about endurance, about finding beauty in harshness, about the stories that could only be understood by those who had experienced difficulty. As spring came to the mountains, Luna witnessed the symphony of melting, a cacophony of drips and trickles and rushes as frozen stories became liquid again and resumed their journey downward. The arrival of spring sounds was gradual, then sudden. One day the mountains were silent and white. The next they were alive with birds returning, with insects emerging, with plants pushing through the diminishing snow. Each of these returns told a story of cycles, of endings that were really beginnings, of how nature's narratives never truly concluded but just paused and resumed. Luna decided to follow the water down from the mountains, to trace the story from snow to stream to river. The journey of water, she realized, was perhaps the most complete story the world had to offer. It included every state of matter, every speed from frozen stillness to raging rapids, every scale from individual drops to vast oceans. Following water was following the story of life itself. The mountain streams told stories of youth and energy, of water that had just begun its journey and was eager to see where it would lead. These streams laughed and babbled, tumbling over rocks with an enthusiasm that was infectious. They were like children's stories, simple and joyful and unaware of the complexities that lay ahead. The fish in these streams were silver flashes of subplot, darting through the main narrative with their own urgent tales of survival and spawning. As streams became rivers, the stories grew deeper and more complex. Rivers had memory, carrying with them the stories of every tributary that joined them, every rock that shaped them, every bridge that crossed them. The sound of a mature river was layered like an orchestral piece, with deep bass notes of powerful currents, middle tones of regular flow, and high notes of spray and splash where the water met obstacles. Luna learned to read the river's moods by its sounds. A river running high with spring melt told stories of abundance and sometimes danger, its voice loud and commanding. A river in late summer, running low and slow, told stories of patience and conservation, of making do with less. A frozen river told stories through its silence, or through the creaks and groans of ice adjusting to temperature changes, like an old house settling in the night. She followed one particular river to where it met the sea, and there she witnessed the complex narrative of that meeting. Fresh water and salt water didn't simply mix, they danced around each other, creating layers and currents that told stories of negotiation and compromise. The sounds at the river mouth were confusing and beautiful, neither fully river nor fully ocean, but something entirely unique. Birds gathered there in enormous numbers, their calls adding to the chorus, telling stories of abundance where two ecosystems met and mingled. It was at this confluence that Luna met a fisherman named Samuel who had spent 40 years listening to the stories of fish. He could tell by the sound of a splash what kind of fish had made it, whether it was feeding or fleeing, whether it was healthy or struggling. He taught Luna that every creature had its own sound signature, its own way of interacting with the world that created a unique narrative. Samuel's boat had its own collection of sounds and stories. The creak of oars in oarlocks told of countless journeys across the same waters. The hollow sound of water lapping against the wooden hull was like a drum keeping time for all the stories that had unfolded on and around that boat. Even the silence of waiting for fish to bite had its own narrative quality, a tension like the pause before an important sentence, full of potential. Through Samuel, Luna learned about the stories told by working sounds, the narratives of labor and craft. The rhythm of rowing wasn't just about moving through water. It was about the relationship between human effort and natural resistance, about finding the balance between fighting against something and working with it. The sound of nets being hauled in told stories of hope and disappointment, of empty nets and full ones, of the gamble that every fisherman made when they pushed off from shore. Samuel introduced Luna to the concept of generational sounds, how certain sounds had remained essentially unchanged for thousands of years. The splash of an oar in water sounded the same to them as it had to ancient Greeks or Vikings or Polynesians. These sounds were threads that connected all of human history, stories that transcended language and culture. A baby's cry, a fire crackling, water being poured. These sounds told the same fundamental stories they had always told. But Samuel also showed her the new sounds, the ones that had only existed for a few generations or less. The hum of electric motors, the ping of sonar, the static of radios, these told stories of human innovation and change, of how we were constantly adding new chapters to the world's narrative. He wondered aloud what sounds would exist in the future that they couldn't even imagine, what stories would be told in frequencies they couldn't hear, or through technologies they hadn't invented. Luna spent a full season with Samuel, learning the patient art of listening to water from someone who had made it his life's work. She learned that professional listeners, whether they were fishermen or musicians or doctors with stethoscopes, developed an intimacy with certain sounds that allowed them to hear stories others missed. It was like learning a language, Samuel said, but more than that, it was like learning to think in that language, to dream in it. As autumn arrived and the fishing season drew to a close, Luna felt the pull to continue her journey. She had been traveling for over a year now, and while she had learned so much about the stories that sounds told, she felt there was something still missing, some understanding that eluded her. She said goodbye to Samuel and his creaking boat, to the river mouth with its convergence of narratives, and set off inland toward the prairies and plains. The grasslands presented Luna with a new kind of sonic landscape. Here, the sounds were horizontal, spreading out across vast distances without mountains or forests to interrupt them. The wind was the dominant narrator here, and it had endless space to tell its stories. The grass itself became an instrument, millions of stems vibrating together to create a sustained whisper that seemed to contain all the secrets of the earth. She discovered that the prairie told stories on a scale she hadn't encountered before. While forests told stories of individual trees and mountains told stories of specific peaks, the grasslands told stories of entirety, of ecosystems that stretched beyond the horizon. The sound of wind through grass was like the breathing of the earth itself, inhaling and exhaling in patterns that matched the seasons and the years. Here Luna met indigenous peoples who had been listening to these stories for thousands of years. They taught her that the land remembered everything, that every sound left an impression that could be heard if you knew how to listen. They showed her how to put her ear to the ground and hear vibrations that traveled through solid earth, stories that moved through stone and soil. The buffalo that had once thundered across these plains in vast herds had left their stories in the ground, and even though the herds were gone, their narrative echoed still in the behavior of the wind and the growth patterns of the grass. These people taught Luna about sacred sounds, the ones that were more than just stories but were connections to something greater. The drum, they explained, mimicked the heartbeat of the earth. The rattle imitated the sound of rain or seeds in a gourd, carrying prayers and intentions. Certain songs had been sung for so long that they had become part of the landscape itself, stories that the land expected to hear and would answer if sung correctly. Luna participated in ceremonies where sound was used to heal, where the vibrations of drums and voices were believed to realign what had become displaced. She felt the power of communal sound, how a group of people making music together created a story larger than any individual could tell. The harmonies they created weren't just pleasing to the ear. They were statements about cooperation and community, about how different voices could come together to create something beautiful. In the grasslands, Luna also learned about the stories told by absence of expected sound. The sudden silence of insects before a storm told a story of preparation and instinct. The missing call of a usually vocal bird species told stories of migration or environmental change. She began to understand that listening for what wasn't there was just as important as listening to what was. She spent nights on the prairie where the darkness was so complete that sound became her primary sense. Without visual distractions, she could hear stories she had been missing. The underground narratives of burrowing animals, the high-pitched communications of bats, the subtle movements of nocturnal hunters and their prey. The night prairie was far from silent. It was a different chapter of the same story, told by a different cast of characters. During her time in the grasslands, Luna experienced her first tornado. The sound was unlike anything she had encountered before, a roar that contained within it 1,000 other sounds, debris and wind and pressure changes that created a narrative of pure power. But even more interesting than the tornado itself was the sound before and after it. The unusual stillness that preceded it, as if the world was gathering its energy. The strange quiet after it passed, as if the world needed a moment to understand what had just happened. She learned that extreme weather had its own library of sounds and stories. Thunder wasn't just noise. It was the sound of lightning's story, the narrative of electrical discharge told through the medium of rapidly heated air. Hail on a roof was percussion for a story about ice forming in clouds and gravity overcoming updrafts. Even the subtle pressure changes before weather fronts arrived told stories to those who knew how to listen. Stories about masses of air meeting and negotiating their differences. As Luna traveled further into the continental interior, she encountered deserts where sound behaved differently again. In the dry air and open spaces, sounds carried incredibly far but also seemed to evaporate, as if the desert was so thirsty it drank even the sounds. The stories here were minimalist, each sound standing alone rather than blending into a chorus. The desert taught Luna about the economy of sound, how in places where energy was precious, nothing was wasted, including the energy required to make noise. Desert animals were largely silent, saving their sounds for when they truly mattered. When they did vocalize, it was with purpose and precision. The rattle of a snake wasn't just a warning. It was a carefully calibrated story about danger that could be understood by every creature that heard it. She learned to appreciate the subtle sounds of the desert, the tick of rocks cooling in the evening as they contracted, the whisper of sand moving grain by grain down the face of a dune, the rare and precious sound of rain hitting dry earth, a story of relief and renewal that might only be told once a year or less. These sounds required patience to hear, and even more patience to understand. In the desert, Luna met an astronomer named David who had come to this remote place for the darkness that allowed him to see the stars, but who had discovered that the silence allowed him to hear things he'd never noticed before. He introduced Luna to the idea that sound and light were related, both waves traveling through space, both carrying information and stories. He had equipment that could translate radio waves from space into sound, letting Luna listen to the stories told by distant stars and planets. The sounds from space were alien and beautiful, nothing like the organic sounds of Earth. They were stories told in wavelengths that human ears couldn't naturally detect, translated into our audible range through technology. Jupiter sounded like an ocean of electronic signals. Saturn's rings sang in harmonies that seemed impossible. The sun itself was a constant roar of nuclear fusion, the fundamental story of the energy that made all life on Earth possible. David explained that these cosmic sounds had been telling their stories long before Earth existed, and would continue long after it was gone. It put all the earthly sounds Luna had been listening to into a new perspective. Every story she had heard, from the smallest insect's chirp to the mightiest ocean wave, was part of a much larger narrative, a tiny subplot in the grand story of the universe. But rather than making earthly sounds seem less important, this cosmic perspective made Luna treasure them more. The sound of a child laughing, she realized, was remarkable precisely because of how unlikely it was. How many things had to happen exactly right for that sound to exist? Every bird song was a miracle of evolution and circumstance. Every word spoken was the universe becoming conscious of itself and telling its own story. Luna stayed with David through several cycles of the moon, listening to both terrestrial and celestial sounds. She noticed how the desert sounds changed with the lunar phases, how certain animals were more active during the full moon, how even the wind seemed to behave differently. The moon, David explained, pulled on everything, not just the tides, and sensitive listeners could hear its influence in subtle changes to familiar sounds. One night, during a meteor shower, they lay on their backs in the sand and listened to the tiny pops and hisses that David's equipment picked up as meteors entered Earth's atmosphere. Each one was a story millions of years in the making, a piece of cosmic debris that had wandered the solar system until this exact moment when it met its end in a brief flash of light and sound. Luna thought about how every ending was also a beginning, how the meteors brought materials from space to Earth, contributing to the ongoing story of the planet. As her time in the desert came to an end, Luna realized she had been traveling for nearly 2 years. She had heard so many stories, had learned so many ways of listening, but she felt that her journey was approaching some kind of conclusion or transformation. She decided to visit one more ecosystem before considering what to do next: the rainforest. The journey to the rainforest was a gradual crescendo of sound. As she moved from dry lands to wet, from sparse vegetation to dense, the volume and complexity of the sonic landscape increased dramatically. By the time she reached the true rainforest, the sound was almost overwhelming, a wall of noise that seemed impenetrable at first. It was like trying to read 1,000 books simultaneously, each in a different language. But Luna had learned patience and focus in her travels. She found a research station where scientists studied the rainforest's biodiversity, and they welcomed her interest in the sounds of the jungle. They taught her that the rainforest had distinct sonic layers, just like it had distinct physical layers from forest floor to canopy. Each layer had its own community of sound makers, its own schedule, its own stories to tell. The forest floor told stories of decomposition and recycling, of how every ending fed a new beginning. The sounds here were muffled by the thick layer of decomposing leaves, creating an intimate acoustic space. Insects clicked and rustled through the leaf litter. Fungi grew with sounds too quiet for human ears, but which Luna could almost feel. A kind of expanding whisper that spoke of patient consumption and transformation. The understory, the space between floor and canopy, was where most of the mammals told their stories. Monkeys called to each other with complex vocalizations that conveyed not just location but mood, intention, and social status. Each species had its own language, but they all understood the universal sounds of alarm, the calls that meant danger that every creature respected regardless of species. The canopy was the loudest layer, where birds and insects created a symphony that began before dawn and continued past dusk. Luna learned that the dawn chorus wasn't random, but carefully orchestrated. Each species had its own time to sing, its own frequency range that didn't interfere with others. It was like a jazz performance where everyone knew when to solo and when to support. The stories told in the canopy were about territory and mating, about competition and cooperation, about the endless dance of survival and reproduction. But it was the emergent layer, the tops of the tallest trees that broke through the canopy, where Luna heard the most interesting sounds. Up here, where the trees swayed in winds that never reached the forest floor, she heard stories of connection between earth and sky. Birds that lived their entire lives without touching the ground told stories of a completely three-dimensional existence. The wind through these highest leaves carried seeds and pollen, stories of genetic information traveling miles to write new chapters in distant locations. The rainforest researchers introduced Luna to the concept of the soundscape as an indicator of ecosystem health. A healthy rainforest, they explained, had a full and complex sound signature. When parts of that signature went missing, when certain frequencies fell silent, it indicated that something was wrong. They were documenting these soundscapes, creating a library of what healthy ecosystems sounded like so that future generations would know what they were trying to preserve or restore. Luna spent weeks learning to identify individual species by their sounds, each one telling its own unique story within the larger narrative. The howler monkeys with their impossibly loud calls that could be heard for miles, establishing territory through pure volume. The quiet buzz of hummingbirds, their wings beating so fast they created their own musical note. The crack of branches breaking as large animals moved through the forest, each snap a decision about where to place weight, where to trust the structure of the forest. She discovered that rain in the rainforest had its own complex narrative structure. It didn't just fall. It was mediated by millions of leaves, each one changing the size and velocity of drops, creating a layered percussion ensemble that could last for hours. The sound of rain on different leaves told different stories, broad leaves drumming deeply, thin leaves tinkling like chimes, waxy leaves creating sharp pops as drops bounced off them. Thunder in the rainforest was unlike thunder anywhere else Luna had experienced. The sound bounced off the thousands of surfaces, creating rolling echoes that seemed to go on forever. Lightning strikes on tall trees created their own stories, the crack of splitting wood followed by the crash of falling branches, then the slow adjustment of the forest to this new gap in the canopy. Within days, the competition to fill that gap would begin, plants racing upward toward the newly available sunlight, their growth almost audible in its urgency. Night in the rainforest was not quieter than day, just different. The nocturnal shift took over, with new storytellers emerging. Frogs became the dominant vocalists, their choruses so loud that conversation became difficult. Each species of frog had its own call, from deep bass groans to high-pitched whistles, creating an amphibian orchestra that performed elaborate pieces that lasted all night. Luna learned that these weren't just random noises, but complex communications about weather, mating availability, and territory. The insects of the night had their own stories. Crickets with their metronomic chirps that sped up and slowed down with temperature, making them natural thermometers. Cicadas with their alien-sounding drones that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Moths with wings that whispered against leaves as they navigated by moonlight, their flight patterns writing invisible stories in the air that only echolocation could read. Luna discovered that some of the most interesting rainforest sounds happened at frequencies humans couldn't normally hear. The researchers had equipment that could detect ultrasonic and infrasonic communications. Elephants in distant parts of the forest communicated through vibrations in the ground that traveled for miles. Certain plants even made ultrasonic clicks when they were stressed by drought or damage, a kind of silent scream that attracted or repelled specific insects. During her time at the research station, Luna met a linguist named Maria, who was studying the relationship between human languages and the sounds of the environments where they developed. Languages that evolved in rainforests, Maria explained, often had more distinctions between similar sounds because speakers needed to communicate over the constant background noise. Desert languages might have longer, more sustained vowels that carried better over distance. Mountain languages often included whistling components that could traverse valleys. This connection between human language and environmental sound fascinated Luna. She began to understand that human stories weren't separate from natural stories, but were woven from the same sonic fabric. The rhythms of our speech matched the rhythms of our surroundings. Our music imitated the sounds that surrounded our ancestors. Even our technologies, Maria pointed out, often mimicked natural sounds. From the sonar we copied from bats to the Velcro we inspired from burr attachments. Maria introduced Luna to the concept of acoustic ecology, the study of soundscapes and how they affected and were affected by living things. Every environment had its own acoustic niche, and creatures evolved to communicate within available frequency ranges that weren't already occupied. It was like nature had divided up the spectrum of sound, the way humans divided up radio frequencies, ensuring everyone had their own channel to broadcast on. But human-made sounds were disrupting these natural arrangements. The noise of chainsaws and machinery drowned out animal communications. The constant hum of generators masked the subtle sounds that creatures used for navigation and hunting. Even well-meaning ecotourism created sound pollution that changed animal behavior. Luna could hear it herself, the way the forest grew quieter near human settlements. Not peaceful quiet, but stressed quiet, the silence of creatures that had been pushed out or had learned to hide. One morning, after a particularly powerful thunderstorm, Luna woke to find that a massive tree had fallen near the research station. The crash had been tremendous, but what interested her more was the aftermath. The fallen tree had created a gap in the canopy, and immediately the sound environment changed. More light meant more photosynthesis, which meant more insect activity. Birds that preferred open spaces moved in while deep forest species moved away. Within hours, the acoustic signature of that part of the forest had been rewritten. She spent the entire day by that fallen tree, listening to how the forest adapted to this change. Vines that had been waiting in the shadows began their race upward, and she swore she could hear them growing, a kind of stretching sound like rope being pulled taut. Insects that had lived in the fallen tree emerged, confused, and began the process of finding new homes, their searching creating a temporary increase in buzzing and clicking as they communicated their displacement. The fallen tree also became a bridge, a highway for creatures that preferred not to travel on the ground. Luna could hear the patter of feet across the bark, each species with its own rhythm and weight. Monkeys bounded across in groups, their passage a percussion ensemble. A jaguar padded silently across at dusk, its presence known more by the sudden silence of other creatures than by any sound it made itself. As the weeks passed, Luna watched and listened as the fallen tree became incorporated into the forest story. Fungi began breaking it down, insects bored into it, birds nested in its hollows. The tree's death became 100 different stories of life, its solid wood transformed into soil and air and new growth. The sound of this decomposition was subtle but constant, a whisper of transformation that underpinned all the louder narratives of the forest. During the full moon, Luna climbed to a platform in the canopy to experience the forest from above. The sounds were completely different up here. She was above some sound layers and within others. The wind was stronger, carrying sounds from miles away. She could hear the distant roar of a river she hadn't even known existed. Aircraft passed overhead, their mechanical drone a reminder that even this remote forest existed within a globalized world. From this height, she could also hear the forest breathing. It wasn't metaphorical. There was an actual sound to the collective respiration of billions of leaves exchanging gases with the atmosphere. During the day, when photosynthesis was active, the sound was different than at night when only respiration occurred. It was subtle, like the difference between inhaling and exhaling, but once she noticed it, she couldn't unhear it. The research station had a library of recorded sounds from the forest, some going back decades. Luna spent hours listening to these archives, hearing how the forest's voice had changed over time. Some species that had been common in older recordings were now rare or absent. New sounds had appeared, including invasive species that brought their foreign accents to the local dialect. Climate change was audible in the shifting timing of seasonal sounds, migrations happening earlier or later, breeding calls coming at unusual times. One of the researchers, an older man named Roberto who had been recording forest sounds for 40 years, shared with Luna his most precious recording. It was of a bird species that had gone extinct 5 years ago, its unique song now existing only in this digital format. As Luna listened to the complex melody that would never again be performed live, she understood that she was hearing a ghost story, a narrative that had ended but somehow continued in this technological afterlife. Roberto taught Luna about the responsibility that came with recording sounds. Every recording was a historical document, a piece of evidence about what the world sounded like at a particular moment. He had recordings of glaciers that no longer existed, of forests that had been cleared, of rivers that had been dammed. These sounds were testimonies, stories that bore witness to change and loss, but also to resilience and adaptation. But Roberto also had recordings of recovery, places that had been silent returning to life as conservation efforts succeeded. Species thought extinct rediscovered and added their voices back to the chorus. Young forests growing on abandoned farmland, their adolescent sounds gradually maturing into the complex symphonies of established ecosystems. These were stories of hope, proof that some narratives could be rewritten, that some silences were temporary. Luna began making her own recordings, not with equipment but with memory. She practiced holding sounds in her mind, creating a mental library of the stories she'd heard. She found that by closing her eyes and concentrating, she could replay conversations between birds, recreate the exact rhythm of rain on leaves, and recall the precise pitch of wind through grass. Her mind became an archive of the world's stories, told in their original language of sound. As the rainy season transitioned to dry, the forest stories shifted. Water became precious, and the sounds of the forest reflected this. Leaves grew harder and made different sounds when touched by wind or animals. Streams that had babbled constantly grew quiet or silent. Animals congregated around remaining water sources, creating temporary communities of species that usually avoided each other, their combined voices telling stories of truce and necessity. Luna noticed that scarcity changed the nature of the forest's narratives. When resources were abundant, the stories were about competition and territory. When resources were scarce, the stories became about cooperation and survival. She heard examples of different species working together, warning each other of predators, sharing information about food sources. The forest had its own economy of information, with sound as the currency. One night, Luna was awakened by a sound she had never heard before. It was like singing, but not quite, like wind, but too regular, like nothing she could compare it to. She followed the sound through the dark forest, guided only by her ears, until she came to a clearing where she found the source. It was a group of indigenous people performing a ceremony, their voices and instruments creating sounds that seemed to bridge the gap between human and natural, between story and song. They welcomed Luna to observe, and she spent the rest of the night listening to their performance. Their music included imitations of forest sounds so perfect that actual birds began responding, creating a dialogue between human and non-human voices. The ceremony told stories of creation and destruction, of the relationships between all living things, of the responsibilities humans had to the forest and the forest to humans. The shaman explained to Luna through a translator that they believed sound was the thread that wove all things together. Every sound created a connection, a relationship between the maker and the hearer. To make sound carelessly was to create tangled, broken connections. To make sound with intention and respect was to strengthen the web that held the world together. Their ceremonies were about maintaining these sonic relationships, keeping the conversations between human and nature flowing. Luna learned from them about plants that taught songs to those who knew how to listen. They showed her how to hear the different voices of the forest spirits, each associated with different aspects of nature. The spirit of the river sounded like laughter and tears mixed together. The spirit of the mountain sounded like deep drums played from inside the earth. The spirit of the sky sounded like flutes made of wind and light. They taught her about healing sounds, frequencies that could mend what was broken in body or spirit. They demonstrated how certain rhythms could induce trance states where the boundaries between self and environment dissolved, where one could hear the stories that normally required a lifetime to understand. They showed her how silence could be used as a tool, how the absence of sound could be more powerful than any noise. As dawn broke and the ceremony concluded, the shaman gave Luna a gift, a small flute made from bamboo that grew nowhere near this forest. It had been passed down through generations, and each owner had added their own subtle modifications, their own stories carved into its surface. When Luna played it, tentatively at first, she heard not just her own breath transformed into music, but the echoes of all who had played it before, their stories resonating through the simple instrument. With the flute, Luna discovered she could contribute to the soundscape rather than just observe it. She began each morning by playing simple melodies, adding her voice to the dawn chorus. Birds began to recognize her songs and would sometimes answer or incorporate her notes into their own compositions. She was no longer just a listener to the world's stories, but a participant in creating them. The research station was preparing for a major documentation project, attempting to record every sound in a specific section of forest over a 24-hour period. Luna volunteered to help, and through this intensive listening experience, she gained new appreciation for the completeness of the forest's narrative. There was never true silence, never a moment when some story wasn't being told. Even in the deepest part of night, in the heaviest rain, in the hottest part of the day when many creatures rested, something was always speaking. The project revealed patterns Luna hadn't noticed before. There were rush hours in the forest, times when communication peaked. There were quiet periods that served like punctuation, allowing previous messages to be processed before new ones began. There were solo performances where a single creature had the forest's complete attention, and there were crescendos where everyone seemed to vocalize at once, creating walls of sound that contained thousands of individual stories. One afternoon, while reviewing recordings from the project, Luna noticed something unusual. There was a pattern in the sounds, a rhythm that seemed to coordinate across species. Birds, insects, and frogs were all pulsing their calls in sync, creating a unified beat that lasted for several minutes before dissolving back into chaos. When she showed this to the researchers, they were astounded. It suggested a level of acoustic coordination they hadn't imagined possible. This discovery led to a new understanding of the forest as not just a collection of individual sound makers, but as a kind of superorganism that could coordinate its voice when necessary. Perhaps, the researchers speculated, this coordination happened during times of environmental stress or change, a way for the forest to strengthen its collective story when individual voices might get lost. Luna spent her remaining weeks in the rainforest investigating these moments of synchronization. She found that they were more common than anyone had realized, but happened at timescales and frequencies that made them hard to detect. Sometimes the coordination lasted only seconds, sometimes it stretched for hours. Sometimes it was obvious, all creatures calling at once. Sometimes it was subtle, a gradual alignment of rhythms that created an underlying pulse to all the forest sounds. She began to wonder if what she was hearing was the forest thinking, if consciousness could exist at a scale beyond individual organisms. Each sound was like a neuron firing, and the patterns of sounds were thoughts and memories playing out across the landscape. It was a radical idea, but no more radical than the journey she had taken, the expansion of her understanding of what stories could be and how they could be told. As her time in the rainforest came to an end, Luna knew her journey was also reaching its conclusion, at least this chapter of it. She had traveled for nearly 3 years, had listened to stories in every major ecosystem on Earth, and had learned languages she didn't know existed. But more than that, she had learned that listening was not passive but active, not consumption but participation. Every time she heard a sound, she was changed by it, and in being changed, she changed the nature of future sounds she would make and hear. She decided to return to Aliner's village, to share what she had learned with the storyteller who had first imagined her into being. The journey back was different from the journey out. Now she heard the stories in every sound she encountered, understood the narratives that had always been there, but that she hadn't known how to perceive. The rumble of buses told stories of human ambition and routine. The buzz of power lines told stories of energy captured and distributed. Even the mechanical sounds that had once seemed separate from nature's stories were revealed to be part of the same grand narrative, just told in a different dialect. As Luna traveled, she played her bamboo flute in each place she stopped, adding new melodies inspired by local sounds. The flute began to carry all the stories she had heard, transformed into music. Other travelers would stop to listen, and sometimes she would tell them about the sounds hidden within sounds, the stories they were missing. Some thought her eccentric, but others began to listen more carefully to their environments, to hear the narratives that surrounded them. She passed back through the desert, and it sounded different now. She could hear the patience in its silence, the strength in its minimalism. The rocks sang their slow songs of erosion and time. The sand whispered secrets of mountains ground to dust, and ocean floors lifted to dry land. Even the heat had a sound, a shimmer in the air that created subtle distortions in other sounds, like the desert was constantly revising the stories that passed through it. She crossed the grasslands as autumn was turning them gold, and the wind through dry grass sounded like applause for her journey. She could hear individual stories within the collective rustle, seeds preparing for dispersal, insects settling in for winter, roots pulling nutrients deeper into the earth. The migrating birds overhead called out navigation songs, stories of magnetic fields and star positions, translated into cries that guided whole flocks across continents. She climbed back into the mountains as the first snows began to fall, and the silence of snow was no longer empty but full of muffled stories. Each snowflake carried its own narrative of formation in the clouds, its unique crystalline structure, a frozen story of temperature and humidity and chance. The mountains welcomed her back with avalanches in the distance, reminders that even the most solid-seeming things were in constant motion, constantly telling new stories. She followed the rivers down from the mountains, and now she could hear all the individual narratives within their flow. The stories of specific drops that had been snowing on specific peaks. The stories of minerals dissolved from particular rocks. The stories of fish swimming upstream, writing their urgent reproductive narratives against the current. The river was a library of liquid stories, constantly being written and rewritten. She passed through forests where the trees were preparing for winter, their sap slowing, their energy retreating to roots. The sounds were quieter but deeper, like the forest was mumbling in its sleep, telling dreams of spring while enduring autumn's fade. Leaves fell with sounds like pages turning, each one closing a chapter of photosynthesis and growth. The bare branches that remained would soon sing different songs when winter winds played them like strings. Finally, after months of travel, Luna saw the familiar outline of Elinar's village in the valley. It looked exactly the same, but it sounded completely different to her now. She could hear the stories in every chimney's smoke, every door's creak, every voice calling across the evening air. The village wasn't just a place where people lived. It was a composition of thousands of small stories being told simultaneously, harmonizing and creating dissonance, starting and ending and continuing. She found Elinar on the same porch, in the same chair, surrounded by different children but telling stories in the same voice. Elinar looked up as Luna approached, and a smile of recognition crossed her weathered face. Without words, she understood that Luna had completed the journey she had been sent on, and had learned what she had needed to learn. Luna sat at Elinar's feet, just as she had as a child in the story, and began to tell her own story. But she didn't just use words. She played her flute. She recreated the sounds she had heard. She taught the children to listen to the evening sounds around them with new ears. She showed them how the creak of Eleanor's rocking chair could become the mast of a ship or the branch of an ancient tree. She demonstrated how their own breathing could tell stories of excitement or calm, how their heartbeats were drums keeping time for their personal narratives. Eleanor listened with tears in her eyes, understanding that her story had become real in ways she hadn't imagined. Luna had not just heard the stories in sounds. She had become a bridge between the world of sound and the world of human understanding. She had brought back gifts more valuable than any treasure: the ability to hear the world's stories and the wisdom to share them with others. As the sun set on that first evening of Luna's return, the two women sat in comfortable silence that wasn't really silence at all. They listened to the village settling into evening, to the mountains standing guard, to the stream running its endless race to the sea. They heard the stories that had always been there, waiting for someone to listen, waiting for someone to understand that every sound was a story and every story was a sound. The children around them began to hear it too. One pointed out the narrative in a dog's bark. Another noticed the story told by their mother calling them home for dinner. They began to understand that they were surrounded by stories, swimming in narratives, that the world was constantly telling itself about itself, and that they were both audience and narrator in this endless performance. Eleanor began to weave Luna's journey into her evening stories, but now with a difference. She would pause to let the children hear the actual sounds she was describing. When she told of ocean waves, they would listen to the distant memory of water in the stream. When she told of forest birds, they would notice the evening chorus of their own local species. The stories became three-dimensional, existing not just in words, but in the actual sonic environment around them. Luna taught the children games of listening. They would close their eyes and count how many different sounds they could identify. They would try to follow a single sound from its beginning to its end. They would make their own sounds and listen to how the environment responded. They learned that they could have conversations with the world using sound, that every noise they made rippled out and created responses, sometimes immediate, sometimes delayed. She showed them how to find rhythms in random sounds, how the irregular drip of water from a roof could become a complex percussion pattern if you listened with the right attention. She taught them to hear melodies in wind, harmonies in crowds, symphonies in thunderstorms. The world became their orchestra, and they learned they were both conductors and instruments. Some of the adults in the village thought Luna had gone a bit mad, hearing stories in every sound, but others began to notice what she was teaching the children. A farmer realized he could hear the health of his crops in the way wind moved through them. A blacksmith noticed that the sound of his hammer on metal told him stories about temperature and composition he had only known through sight before. A mother discovered she could hear her baby's needs in the subtle variations of its cries, stories of hunger or tiredness, or the simple desire to be held. The village began to change in subtle ways. People spoke more softly, understanding that their words were adding to the sonic environment. Musicians began incorporating environmental sounds into their compositions. Workers paid attention to the rhythms of their labor, finding ways to make necessary noise more harmonious. The village became more aware of itself as a sonic community, a collection of storytellers, whether they used words or not. Luna established a kind of school, though it was unlike any school the village had seen before. Classes were held outside, in different locations depending on what sounds were being studied. Students learned to identify birds not just by sight, but by song. They learned to predict weather by the sounds of wind and pressure changes. They learned that science and art were not separate things, but different ways of understanding the same stories. She taught them about the sounds they couldn't hear, the frequencies above and below human perception where other stories were being told. She showed them how to use simple tools to detect these sounds, to translate them into ranges they could perceive. The children were amazed to discover that flowers were singing ultrasonic songs to bees, that elephants miles away were communicating through the ground, that the earth itself hummed at a frequency too low to hear, but not too low to feel. They learned about the history of sound, how the first sounds on Earth were geological, the planet itself finding its voice through volcanism and tectonics, how life added new chapters to this story, from the first metabolic reactions that created minute vibrations to the complex vocalizations of modern animals. How humans had added their own unique contributions, from speech to music to the industrial cacophony of modern civilization. Luna taught them about the future of sound too, about how human activities were changing the planet's soundscape. Some sounds were being lost forever as species went extinct. New sounds were being created by technology. The balance of natural and artificial sounds was shifting, and with it, the stories the world told about itself were changing. She helped them understand that they had a responsibility to be conscious of the sounds they created and preserved. The lessons weren't always serious. Luna taught the children to create sound effects for Eleanor's stories, to become the storm when she told of tempests, to become the crowd when she told of markets. They learned to throw their voices, to use echoes, to create acoustic illusions. They discovered that sound could be playful, could be used to create joy and laughter as well as to communicate information. She organized listening expeditions where the whole village would walk together in silence, experiencing their familiar environment through sound alone. They discovered places where sound behaved strangely, where echoes lasted longer than they should, or where certain frequencies were amplified or dampened. These places became special to them, acoustic landmarks that existed in sonic space rather than visual space. The village began to celebrate sound in ways they never had before. They held festivals where the main attraction was not music, but the sounds of everyday life presented as performance. The carpenter would demonstrate the different sounds of different woods. The weaver would show how different fibers made different sounds when worked. The baker would perform the percussion of kneading and the whisper of rising dough. Luna introduced them to the idea of soundscapes as heritage, as something to be preserved for future generations. They began recording the sounds of their village life, understanding that these sounds would change or disappear over time. The particular squeak of the well pump that everyone complained about but would miss when it was replaced. The specific echo pattern in the old church that would change if the building was renovated. The morning call of the rooster that had woken the village for 15 years. Children began creating sound diaries, recording not what they did each day, but what they heard. These became remarkable documents of daily life, capturing moods and moments through sonic description. A child might write about the tired sound of their father's footsteps after a long day of work, or the excited pitch of their dog's bark when they came home from school, or the comfortable silence of studying next to a friend. The village's relationship with music also evolved. Musicians began to understand that they weren't creating sound in a vacuum, but adding to an existing sonic environment. Concerts became collaborations with the ambient sounds rather than attempts to override them. A cricket that chirped during a quiet passage was no longer an interruption, but a guest performer. The rumble of distant thunder became percussion. Even mistakes and unexpected sounds were incorporated into performances. Luna worked with Alina to create new types of stories that existed as much in sound as in words. They developed a form of narrative where the story emerged from the interaction between planned words and spontaneous environmental sounds. Alina might begin a sentence about a character walking through a forest, then pause to let the actual sound of wind in trees complete the thought. It was improvisation and composition combined, a partnership between human creativity and natural expression. The older people in the village, some of whom had initially been skeptical of Luna's ideas, began to share their own sound memories. They recalled the specific sounds of their childhoods that no longer existed. The particular whistle of the old steam train that used to pass through the valley, the sound of the mill wheel that had turned for generations before the mill closed, the evening call of the lamp lighter before electric streetlights were installed. These sonic memories became precious, stories told in a language that was partially extinct. Luna helped them understand that every generation lived in a different soundscape, that the sonic environment was constantly evolving, just like language and culture. The children growing up now would have different sound memories than their parents and grandparents. The sounds of digital devices, of new types of transportation, of different species of birds as migration patterns shifted with climate change. Each generation was living in and creating a unique chapter in the ongoing story of sound. She also helped them appreciate the constants, the sounds that connected all generations. The sound of rain on roofs had been essentially the same for centuries. Bobbies cried the same way they always had. Fire crackled with the same voice it had used since humans first learned to control it. These unchanging sounds were anchors, reminders that despite all the change, some stories remained constant. The village began to influence neighboring communities. Visitors came to learn about this new way of listening, of understanding the world through sound. Luna and Alina trained other teachers who spread these ideas to other villages and towns. Slowly, a movement grew of people who understood that the world was full of stories being told in frequencies and rhythms and timbres rather than words. Scientists became interested in what was happening in the village. They came to study whether this intensive listening practice was changing how people's brains processed sound. They found that the children who had grown up with Luna's teachings showed enhanced ability to distinguish between similar sounds, to track multiple audio streams simultaneously, to remember and reproduce complex acoustic patterns. But more than that, they showed increased empathy, better emotional regulation, and stronger connections to their environment. The scientists theorized that learning to listen to the world's stories created a sense of belonging and purpose. When you understood that you were part of a vast narrative being told by every atom vibrating in the universe, it was harder to feel alone or meaningless. When you realized that every sound you made became part of the world's story, it was easier to be mindful of your impact. Artists also came to the village, inspired by this new understanding of sound and story. Painters attempted to visualize soundscapes. Sculptors created pieces that sang in the wind. Poets wrote verses that existed as much in their sound as their meaning. Dancers choreographed movements to environmental sounds rather than music. The village became a hub of creative exploration, all centered around the idea that stories were being told everywhere, all the time, if only we knew how to listen. Luna continued to develop her own understanding, realizing that her journey had not ended when she returned to the village, but had simply entered a new phase. Now, instead of traveling to hear new sounds, she was going deeper into the sounds that surrounded her daily. She could spend hours listening to a single tree, hearing how its voice changed with wind speed, with temperature, with the time of day. She found infinite complexity in what had once seemed simple. She began to experience what she called deep listening, states where the boundary between herself and the sound environment dissolved. In these moments, she didn't hear sounds as something external but felt them as part of her own being. Her heartbeat synchronized with rhythms in the environment. Her breathing matched the pulse of the wind. Her thoughts seemed to emerge from the acoustic space rather than from her own mind. These experiences led her to profound philosophical questions. If she could lose herself in sound, did that mean the self was just another story being told? If sounds could trigger memories and emotions, were sounds themselves a kind of consciousness? If the universe was made of vibrations, as physicists claimed, then was everything ultimately sound, just at frequencies beyond our perception? These questions didn't have answers, but asking them deepened her appreciation for the mystery of sound and story. Alina, now very elderly, spent more and more time in silence, but it was a rich silence, full of remembered sounds and stories. She told Luna that she could hear entire symphonies in her memory, could replay conversations from decades past, and could travel the world through remembered sounds. Her deafness was increasing with age, but paradoxically, she said she was hearing more than ever before, just hearing it from within rather than without. The two women would sit together in the evenings, one listening to the external world, one to the internal, both understanding that the division between internal and external was itself just a story. Luna would describe what she was hearing, and Alina would describe what she was remembering, and together they would weave these into new narratives that existed between past and present, between reality and memory. They talked about what would happen when Alina was gone, when her voice no longer told stories on the porch. Luna assured her that the stories would continue, that Alina's voice had become part of the village's soundscape, echoing in the memories of everyone who had heard her. Every story she had told had ripples that would continue spreading, influencing stories that would be told generations from now. Death, they agreed, was not the end of a story, but a transformation of how it was told. As Alina's health declined, the village began to gather more often to hear her stories. But now they also came to listen to the sounds of her storytelling, the particular rhythm of her breathing between sentences, the creak of her chair as she leaned forward at exciting moments, the soft rustle of her clothes as she gestured. They understood that these sounds were as much a part of the stories as the words, and they wanted to remember them. When Alina finally passed, it was during a thunderstorm, and Luna always wondered if she had chosen that moment deliberately, wanting her final silence to be filled with nature's own dramatic storytelling. The funeral was unlike any the village had held before. Yes, there were words spoken, but there were also long periods of listening, of hearing the world continue its stories even in the face of loss. The rain on the church roof became Alina's final tale, a story about cycles and continuity, about how every ending was also a beginning. Luna took over Alina's spot on the porch, not as a replacement but as a continuation. She told stories that wove together words and sounds that invited listeners to participate in creating the narrative. Children and adults alike would gather to hear and to listen, to learn that they were all part of the endless story the world was telling itself. She developed new techniques for sonic storytelling. She would begin a story and then pause, asking listeners to continue it using only sounds they could make with their bodies or objects around them. These collaborative narratives were never the same twice, always influenced by who was present, what sounds were available, what moods were in the air. They were living stories, growing and changing with each telling. Luna also began teaching people to hear the stories in their own bodies. The stomach growling wasn't just hunger, but a story about digestion and metabolism. The crack of joints was a narrative about aging and use. Even the sound of blood in your ears when everything else was quiet was a story. The rhythmic tale of circulation that had been telling itself since before you were born and would continue until after you died. She helped people understand that illness and health had different sounds, that doctors had always known this with stethoscopes and percussion, but that everyone could learn to hear the stories their bodies were telling. A cough wasn't just a symptom, but a narrative about irritation and expulsion. A sigh was a story about tension and release. Learning to listen to these bodily narratives helped people understand and care for themselves better. The village evolved into a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand sound and story. People came from around the world to learn the art of listening, to discover the narratives hidden in their everyday soundscapes. Luna trained teachers who went out to establish schools of listening in other places, spreading the understanding that the world was full of stories waiting to be heard. Technology began to be developed inspired by the village's philosophy. Apps that helped people identify and understand environmental sounds. Recording devices designed not just for music, but for capturing the full complexity of soundscapes. Virtual reality experiences that were primarily acoustic rather than visual, allowing people to explore sonic environments from around the world. But Luna always emphasized that technology was just a tool, that the real work of listening happened in the space between the ear and the mind, in the attention and intention brought to sound. You could have the most sophisticated equipment in the world and still miss the stories if you weren't truly present, truly open to hearing. As she aged, Luna began to think about legacy, about what would remain of her work after she was gone. She realized that she couldn't preserve the sounds themselves, not really. Recordings were always interpretations, always missing some frequencies or qualities. What she could preserve was the practice of listening, the understanding that stories were everywhere, the belief that every sound mattered. She began writing, trying to capture in words what she had learned through sound. But writing about sound was like dancing about architecture, always an approximation, always missing something essential. Still, she persisted, creating texts that were more like musical scores than traditional books, with instructions for listening exercises, notations for environmental sounds, spaces for readers to record their own sonic observations. The children who had grown up with her teachings were now adults, raising their own children with an awareness of sonic stories. These third-generation listeners had abilities that amazed even Luna. They could hear patterns and narratives that she missed, and could make connections between sounds that seemed impossible. They were evolving, developing new capacities for acoustic perception and interpretation. Some of them began to explore the therapeutic potential of sound stories. They worked with people who had experienced trauma, helping them to hear new narratives in their environment, to understand that the story of their trauma was just one frequency in a vast spectrum of possible stories. They used sound to help people with anxiety, teaching them to listen to calming environmental narratives rather than the repetitive internal narratives of worry. Others applied these principles to urban planning, designing cities that told better stories through their soundscapes. They created quiet zones not by eliminating sound, but by curating it, ensuring that the sounds present told stories of peace and community rather than stress and isolation. They designed buildings that sang in the wind, parks that amplified bird songs, streets that minimized harsh frequencies while allowing pleasant ones to flourish. Still others became acoustic archaeologists, studying the soundscapes of the past through written records, architectural acoustics, and even fossilized evidence of sound-producing organisms. They reconstructed the sonic environments of ancient civilizations, of prehistoric ecosystems, of the early Earth. These reconstructions were speculative but inspiring, reminding people that the story of sound was older than human history, older than life itself. Luna watched all these developments with wonder and satisfaction. Her simple gift of hearing stories and sounds had become a movement, a philosophy, almost a religion for some. But she always reminded people that it wasn't about believing in something, but about listening to what was already there. The stories existed whether you heard them or not. The gift was in the hearing, in the participation, in adding your own voice to the eternal chorus. As Luna grew very old, her hearing began to fade, just as Alina's had. But like Alina, she found that internal sounds became richer as external ones grew quieter. She could replay entire journeys through sound, could revisit conversations with the wind and water from decades past. Her memory became a vast library of sounds, each one connected to stories, to moments, to the continuous narrative of her life. She spent her final years teaching the deepest lessons, the ones that couldn't be put into words or even sounds but had to be experienced. She taught about the silence between sounds, the potential that existed in quiet, the stories that were waiting to be born. She taught that listening was an act of love, that attending to the world's sounds was a form of prayer.